Role-playing games throughout the 1980s were often not for the faint of heart. They featured complex systems and difficult progression, and they attracted only the most hardcore of fans. But those who persevered did so because they were treated to some of the most in-depth gameplay available at the time, something that was first a hit in the West before finding its way to Japan, where a whole new legion of fans were hungry for what the genre had to offer. At that time, the PC gaming scene was still relatively niche in Japan, but one developer saw the untapped potential and decided to double down on attempting to revolutionize the role-playing genre in their own way, bucking the trends of the time and opting to chase a new experiential form of play that they hoped could bring role-playing to the masses. The culmination of these efforts was Ys, an action RPG unlike anything available at the time. In the years following the conclusion of the Second World War, the world began to enter into a new era that was largely defined by one invention: the computer. The first computers were tools of large companies, organizations, and governments, for back then, they took up a ridiculous amount of space and were far too expensive. But as technology progressed, computers became not only more powerful, but also more affordable, and most importantly, they became smaller. Because of this, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, computers found their way into nearly every place of business in the world, and they were also starting to gain ground in the consumer space as well. And when the market for personal home computers started to take off, it was led by models such as the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and Radio Shack's TRS-80, which helped to popularize the trend in North America. This same trend was witnessed in Japan. Companies like Sharp and Nippon Electric, also known as NEC, got into the home computer market with their own offerings, and the MZ40K and the PC8001 launched in 1978 and 79 respectively. In particular, this era saw NEC's PC8001 rise to dominate the Japanese market. Shortly following its debut at the 1979 Microcomputer Show, it received thousands of orders. And when momentum didn't slow, NEC became established as a major player in the region. Year over year, computers were finding their way into more aspects of life than many had thought possible, and what they offered seemed truly inspiring. One of those taken in by the potential for home computers was a man named Masayuki Kato. Born on the 19th of August 1946, Kato had grown up very much in the shadow of World War II. And following his graduation from college, he found work as a systems engineer for the vehicle manufacturer Nihon Motors. Kato worked there for about a decade throughout the 1970s, but it was while he was sent to work in Bangkok that he first encountered something that truly changed his life: an Apple II. Kato was enthralled by the machine, impressed by its ease of use, and he recognized right away its potential as a delivery system for entertainment, something that set it apart from the more business-orientated computers he'd been used to dealing with throughout his career. Upon returning to Japan, Kato bought his own Apple II and soon began tinkering with it, typing out and inputting game programs published in the back of computer magazines for him and his son to play around with. This eventually led to Kato editing these games and beginning to build an understanding behind what went into making them and how he might one day be able to make his own. Now inspired, Kato wanted to dive headfirst into this very endeavour, so he took a bold risk. He quit his job at Nihon Motors to establish a new company, a company that was to be called Nihon Falcom. The name was inspired by Star Wars, a movie he thoroughly enjoyed. He fused the name of Han Solo's starship, the Millennium Falcon, with the word Nihon for Japan, with Falcon becoming Falcom, as he figured it signified that the company was in the computers industry, and com was a popular suffix to add to company names around the time. Establishing Nihon Falcom in March of 1981, Kato had grand designs for this new venture, including opening up his own computer store and publishing his own software. Unfortunately for Kato though, this dream wasn't possible right away, as funds were tight. And so, to start things off, Nihon Falcom took on business analyst work to build some cash reserves, which soon paid off and enabled him to open his computer store called Computerland Tachigawa. With Computerland Tachigawa, Kato set his sights on becoming Apple's primary Japanese distributor, and due to his infatuation with the Apple II, he was relentless in his pursuit of this goal. It was helped, of course, by the Apple II being a very niche product in Japan. But this association meant Computerland Tachigawa's clientele skewed towards the more hardcore computer enthusiasts as opposed to everyday consumers. Kato was not opposed to this though, as he himself was an enthusiast, and he wanted Computerland Tachigawa to be a place where people could come in, relax, hang out and interact, not just with PCs, but with other enthusiasts. The strategy was, on paper, not the most prudent of business decisions, as this laissez-faire environment didn't necessarily help to sell computers. But it did allow Kato to share his passion, and with a small staff that was composed of himself, his wife and a couple of part-time employees, he began to build a community meeting place of sorts. Before long, Computerland Tachigawa had grown into a place where many local up-and-coming programmers and game fans could hang out, and it was only a matter of time before Kato's consumers started to interact with each other in meaningful ways, which naturally began to lead to conversations around some of them making their own games. One of these regulars turned part-time employee was a young man named Yoshio Kiyo. Also working as a mechanic at the time, Kiyo had spent a good deal of time at Computerland Tachigawa talking to Kato and telling him about his desire to just play with computers all day. As Kato's own ambitions were similar to Kiyo's, after a bit of talking, he got the idea to lean in and decided that Nihon Falcom's next venture as a company should be to start making software, in addition to selling it directly at his store. Thus, in 1982, in the span of about a year after quitting Hino Motors, founding Nihon Falcom and opening Computerland Tachigawa, Kato became the head of a new video game development company. And alongside a ragtag bunch of young computer enthusiasts and game fans eager to cut their teeth in the industry, they sought to make the kinds of games they had always dreamed of playing. The initial efforts of Nihon Falcom were focused on making whatever games they could with the resources they had available. Kato was savvy, however, and even though the company were Apple's official Japanese distributor, he made the decision to focus their development efforts on the hottest PC in Japan instead, NEC's successor to the PC 8001, the PC 88001. But NEC was not the only player at this time. Whereas in North America, where the IBM PC had a monopoly due to its proliferation throughout businesses, with competitors only being able to keep up by offering compatibility with IBM PCs, in Japan, things played out a little differently. There, the IBM PC did not prosper despite impressive technological capabilities, because at the time it lacked dedicated support for the Japanese language. This resulted in Japanese companies filling the void, and the likes of Sharp's X1 and Fujitsu's FM7 were released in 1982 as rivals to NEC's PC-88. NEC had the advantage though, as they had launched their latest product a year earlier than their rivals, and they did so when holding nearly 40% of the market with the PC-8001. When word processing software such as MyLetter, Yukara and Bunpitsu became available, this furthered their advantage as users could write and edit documents, and this meant the PC-88 built on its predecessor, becoming the dream of a hobbyist, as beyond its clear business application, many also started to see its potential as a device for entertainment and storytelling. It wasn't long, therefore, until the PC-8's capabilities were used for gaming. Falcom's early games were created almost like homework projects, with their programmers and designers working on them in addition to their actual schoolwork or other jobs in the back of Computerland Tachigawa, with Yoshio Kiyo himself developing their 1982 debut release, Galactic Wars, almost single-handedly. Following Galactic Wars, Falcom put out an impressive 5 games for the PC-88 in the following year of 1983, including a golf game titled Computer the Golf, also by Kiyo, and a pair of text-based horror adventure games, Horror House and Horror House 2. But it was another project by Kiyo called Panorama To, which was also released in 1983, that shaped the company's legacy more than anyone knew at the time. It served as one of the earliest examples of a full-fledged Japanese-developed role-playing game, featuring first-person dungeon-crawling gameplay that was full of innovative ideas, such as the game flowing in real time with a day and night loop, detailed portraits for shopkeepers, and stat and resource management. The following year, Demon's Ring was released, serving as an adventure game that again showed off Falcom's penchant for creativity and innovation. It used an instantaneous compression expansion system for graphics, allowing them to render real-time on-screen displays as opposed to utilising the slower methods of their contemporaries that sometimes took up to 30 seconds to render. But even though these two games were strong, it was another release called Dragon Slayer that proved to be the real turning point. Released not just for the PC-88, but also the X1 and the FM7, Dragon Slayer was an early attempt at an action RPG, serving as an evolution of the gameplay Kyo had started to tinker with in Panorama Toe. Featuring a top-down view for navigation and upgradable character stats, Demon Slayer fused the role-playing sensibilities of Panorama Toe with faster, arcade-style action, tasking players with battling an array of monsters by bumping into them, all the while solving block-pushing puzzles to progress. It served as a direct competitor to the very popular and influential Hyderlight, and it resonated with players and critics who were just now starting to become aware of this new type of role-playing experience. That both games could coexist showed that fans wanted more, and as the head of the company, this was something Kato planned on delivering. The following year, in 1985, Falcom and Kyo followed up Dragon Slayer with its sequel, Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu. Also released on multiple PC formats, Xanadu was an expansion in every way, and the response was incredible. Xanadu managed to sell more than 400,000 copies in 1985, despite only releasing at the end of October. This success put Nihon Falcom on the map as a leading Japanese game development studio in the role-playing genre, and its success even surprised Kato, who was left trying to figure out how they could capitalize on their upwards trajectory. With Xanadu, Kato knew that Falcom had hit something special, so he decided to exploit the Dragon Slayer series as much as he could. Thus, in 1986, Falcom released two more entries into the series, both the sequel to Xanadu, titled Dragon Slayer Jr. Romancia, and an expansion for Xanadu called Xanadu Scenario 2. With these two products, Kato hoped he could continue to push the original game's profitability even further. But they were also used to bring fresh faces into the company, many of whom were largely untested. Takahito Abe and Yuzo Koshiro, for example, both came into the fray to work on these projects, and neither had a huge amount of experience. Koshiro had begun composing music for the PC-88 as a hobby, inspired by early arcade games from Namco, Konami and Sega. Crafting his own versions of songs from these classic games allowed him to hone his skills, and he soon sent demos of his original works to Falcom and many other publishers, hoping to have them included in a game. So, finally getting the chance to contribute to a hit series like Dragon Slayer was a dream come true for the young musician. In a short time, through efforts like these, Falcom rapidly expanded their game development efforts, looping in lots of young, talented designers and developers to bring in fresh ideas and assist them in their quest to develop quality games for their hardcore fans, and they achieved many accolades as a result of their efforts. In 1986, Nihon Falcom won the Amusement Category Award at SoftBank's Software Maker of the Year, and in 1987 they won numerous awards for Xanadu, including the Grand Prix at the 1986 Popcom Awards hosted by Shogakukan, and the BHS Grand Prize from ASCII. What's more, Xanadu, Xanadu Scenario 2, and Romancia all topped Kadawaka's 1986 Software Awards in early 1987, cementing Falcom as a company to watch. Internally though, there were some concerns. Though the role-playing genre was proving to be both financially and critically fruitful, the company began to wonder about the longevity and accessibility of a genre that demanded a lot from its players. And so they started to worry that role-playing games might have diminishing returns if what they had going for them was that they were difficult and took a lot of effort to complete. Xanadu, for example, had many obfuscated rules and statistics, not to mention that the player could get locked out of completing the game without even knowing it, and that saving was even considered a privilege that cost the player in-game currency to do. Looking at the video game landscape, there was also an appreciation that home consoles like Nintendo's Famicom and Sega's Mark III were proving that there was a space in the market that existed between arcade games and PC games, and that there was clearly a desire for easier-to-swallow adventure games built for more casual audiences, a fact proved by the release and success of Nintendo's own Legend of Zelda, it itself an iteration of the same ideas that Hyderlight and their own Dragon Slayer were based on. This inspired Falcom to try something new, and by the end of 1986, ideas began to be thrown around based upon the idea of making something that could appeal to more consumers, while still building upon what they had learnt thus far. First and foremost was the idea that whatever they made needed to focus on the actual gameplay experience, as this was where they were concerned the role-playing genre was stumbling. Ultimately though, Kato wanted his team to have fun developing games, as he believed that if the creators of the games enjoyed themselves while making it, then the end product would benefit. This notion was captured with Xanadu, but he also noticed that games with storylines were actually harder for creators to enjoy, as they already knew what was going to happen. So, a middle ground had to be found, and to find this space, somewhere in between gameplay and story, the team settled on a new guiding principle for the project: kindness. It was decided that by being kind to the player, they would be able to create a gameplay and narrative experience that was more approachable than the complicated role-playing games that dominated the PC market. And as a result, they would make them not only fun to play, but also fun to make, something that Kato hoped would result in another blockbuster. Taking its name from an old Breton legend of a mythical city that supposedly existed off the coast of Brittany, this new game was to be called Ys, and development began sometime around the beginning of 1987. Kato himself was to serve as producer, but the game's director was Masaya Hashimoto, the role he was planned to fulfill alongside also serving as principal designer and lead programmer. On paper, this felt like a risk, as Kiyo had overseen many of Falcom's hits, but Hashimoto was not a novice, having previously overseen a PC-88 adventure game with RPG elements called Temple of the Sun Aztec 2. Together with scenario writer Tomoyasu Miyazaki, these two were the ones most responsible for shaping what Ys was going to be. Koshiro was then tasked alongside Maiko Ishikawa with providing the game's soundtrack, and Koshiro's younger sister, Ayana Koshiro, supported as a graphic designer. It meant the development team for this project was young, and some members, like Miyazaki, were still in school at the time. But this didn't matter. They were just hungry to prove themselves, and considering most were being given their first lead roles, and a chance to make their mark on the video game world, Kato was banking that this would result in another win for the company. Despite the Famicom continuing to prosper though, Ys was designed for the PC-88, as they felt abandoning their core user base would have been a betrayal, while also making it harder for them to see strong financial returns. And so, using the core design focus of kindness as a base, they began crafting a new kind of role-playing game. Similar to Dragon Slayer, Ys was designed around a bump combat system, but they'd also taken steps to make it easier to understand, while adding some extra gameplay depth. In Dragon Slayer, the bump combat initiated a back and forth with whatever monster was being fought, and it had the potential to be very detrimental to the player with no real way to avoid collateral damage or engage with monsters in a different manner. In Ys, bumping into monsters still did damage, but the monster could also take damage from the back. But to add an element of skill to the gameplay, the team also introduced the ability to attack monsters off-axis from the side and behind as well. Attacking from a direction not head-on allowed the player to effectively dodge reciprocal damage, adding increased importance to placement in combat. But it also meant something else. No longer were battles a tired trading of blows. They could now be fast, and this meant that character progression could also be fast. The Ys team wanted to avoid the grinding for experience that had become so essential to the genre. They felt it was yet another unkind gameplay element, and so they designed experience points and the level up system around the idea of quick progression. By allowing the player to progress at a more rapid pace, the idea was that any time spent interacting with the game would progress the character towards something, hopefully avoiding the feeling that playing Ys was like work and lowering the chance that players could become frustrated or quit the game early. What's more, the team ensured that after the player had gained enough levels, fights with monsters became so easy that they were annihilated with no effort, something that the team felt rather cathartic in an arcadey sort of way, almost like popping bubble wrap. If fights did happen and proved too challenging, another key design feature around kindness was introduced: regenerative health. This came into effect if a character was idling when not in a dungeon, something that also helped to reduce the need for giant inventories of healing items. With these core items in place, Miyazaki went about crafting a scenario that then tied into the idea of constant progression, attempting to create an experience where the narrative was always moving as long as the player was exploring. The subject of the player's focus was then to be a red-haired young man named Adol Christian, and the story was designed to follow his arrival in a land called Asteria and his subsequent quest to uncover the secrets of the ancient land of Ys. Though the story itself was specifically limited in scope, Miyazaki and Hashimoto realised that players would not likely be able to finish Ys in one sitting. So to ensure they didn't lose interest by having to replay a large section of the game every time they hit a game over or took a pause, they decided to implement a save anywhere system. This was a huge feature for Ys, as it meant players weren't going to be punished for exploring, and it also made it easier for players of all skill levels to make permanent progress with each session they played the game in. With these solid foundations in place, focus then shifted to presentation. The decision was taken to prioritise the player's heads-up display, making it easy to keep track of Adol's available gold, total experience points HP, and the current enemy's HP. The tone of the game world's graphics was also made accommodating, featuring bright, well-rendered sprite art. And though character sizes were limited, clever workarounds were done to make the world feel more immersive, such as detailed portraits for shopkeepers and other special NPC conversations, in addition to the game's impressive map designs. These designs were thanks to designers Seigo Akitani and Yoshihiko Kurata. And they featured so many different combinations of tiles that Kurata even developed a program to help them auto-populate trees on the game's maps. The natural terrain elements of Ys's field and caverns then became a highlight feature of the game, as they grounded Adol's adventure, but also provided ample opportunity for nice touches of flair and detail to reinforce the game's immersiveness, such as how Adol could only see in his immediate vicinity inside caves. Another important aspect was the game's soundtrack. After working on Xanadu 2, Koshiro felt more comfortable about showing off his talents, so he created his own sound drivers for the game, which, despite being tricky to implement and giving the programming team a few headaches, helped to give Ys's music a distinctive sound. This was, in part, due to the soundtrack's use of FM synthesis. Though it required less memory, FM synthesis's main drawback was that it didn't particularly sound like real instruments. But this didn't faze Koshiro, as he sought to use FM's specific timbres to his advantage, as he liked the way they sounded and enjoyed that the PC-88 made the sounds in real time, in a way acting as an instrument in and of itself, making it for a truly memorable soundtrack. Because of their experiences and their youthful vigour, things moved at a rapid pace throughout development. But as things progressed, issues did start to crop up with the game's scenario that had to be sorted out. Even though previous games developed by the company had featured stories, none had been as in-depth, and the developers struggled to work around the technical limitations of trying to create a story that was more dense without it being prohibitive. This created some issues regarding the implementation of Miyazaki's story, as he had to try and figure out a way to convey the sentiment without the use of kanji, as all the text had to be displayed as hiragana or katakana instead. This was then compounded by the second issue, which was that, when everything was laid out, they felt the narrative concept was just too big to fit into one game. Even when considering that the team had already tried to limit the scope in order to make it accessible, depicting the full story they had envisioned unfortunately wasn't on the cards, and they had to make some harsh decisions about what stayed and what was cut and potentially held back for future works, if, of course, they were even able to explore them. Once fans and critics learned that Falcom were working on a new game, expectations started to be formed about what it might be. There were those who wanted it to follow in the footsteps of Dragon Slayer and indeed Xanadu, while others expected it to relate to Aztec given the involvement of Hashimoto. This was seen as both good and bad. On the plus side, it was great that fans were anticipating their games and that Kato's approach of trying to build up franchises was working. But on the negative side, they were going to be launching a new IP, and it meant those who were anticipating something related to Dragon Slayer or Aztec were sure to be disappointed, at least in the initial sense. To combat these preconceptions, they therefore had to try and make sure the table was properly set for Ys's success, and this started with the initial marketing campaign. Telegraphing to consumers their plans and vision for Ys's experience, advertisements were run that underlined the game's focus on kindness, declaring a new age for the role-playing genre that was more accessible and player-friendly while not sacrificing narrative, challenge, or replayability. Still, even with this ad campaign, the team knew that players would not be engaged with the gameplay unless they could hook them with the scenario, and so they chose an unorthodox approach. It was not uncommon for games at this time to use their manuals as a way of drawing players into the world, with them often using concept art to stoke the imagination while providing small exposition dumps. But with Ys, this was taken up quite a few notches, as within the game's manual was a substantial amount of backstory and world building. Coming in at around 30 pages, this text was akin to an entire short story, centered around Adol's upbringing and life before the events of Ys, and how he came to Asteria in the first place. While it may have been daunting to leave this amount of exposition out of the game itself, the developers hoped that once players read it, they would become engrossed in Adol's adventure before even turning the game on, and thus would become more invested in role-playing as him. Luckily for Falcom, this approach proved to be a success. When Ys launched in Japan on the PC-88 on the 21st of June 1987, just a mere 5 months after development seriously began, right away it established itself as a solid entry in the burgeoning action RPG genre. Though official sales figures for the game were never released on this platform, Ys stayed at the top of Computer Gaming Magazine Login's top 10 list for 6 months following its release, being highly regarded as a game that players were keen to replay over and over again. In addition, it went on to win first place in Kadokawa Shoten's 1987 Software Awards, cementing Ys as another crown in Nihon Falcom's crown alongside Dragon Slayer. In an effort to hit as much of the PC market as possible right out of the gate, Falcom wasted no time importing Ys to the other major Japanese personal computers. This saw them release for the Sharp X1 the following week, while the PC-98 version came 2 months after, produced in just a couple of weeks by Okitani. Later that year, FM7, 77 and 77AV versions were launched in October, and finally the MSX2 port was delivered to the market in December. These early PC ports were essentially the same game, and the team at Falcom did an amazing job of turning them around so quickly, and to a high standard, in order to widen the launch of Ys as far as they could. However, despite their notable efforts, some versions still saw differences, specifically when it came to the soundtrack. The X1 version, for example, as it didn't have the same capabilities as the PC-88, required Koshiro, Ishikawa and Hashimoto to essentially recompose the game's soundtrack from scratch, and the MSX2 version actually contained new compositions on top of the original soundtrack. These changes, though small, gave each release its own distinct presentation, while showcasing that the team was trying their absolute best to maintain parity across the game's various PC versions, something that didn't necessarily translate that well to the game's wider launch on home consoles. By the back end of 1987, the home console market had proved itself as a viable avenue for publishers to release ports and make a solid profit. And despite their initial reticence to support the Nintendo Famicom, now that all the major PC platforms have been catered for, Falcom decided they could no longer ignore the craze. However, they were aware of their own limitations, so turned to third-party companies to help them port Ys to the Famicom and the Sega Mark III, as they had felt the experience of outsourcing the port of Romancia to Compile, which launched at the back end of 1987, had been a positive one. This time though, for the Famicom version, they chose not to renew their relationship with Compile, and instead opted to work with Victor Musical Industries, who were in the early stages of getting into the video games industry, having produced a few manga-based games based on Outlanders and Fisherman Sanpei. The Famicom version of Ys was released in August of 1988, over 1 year after the initial PC launch, but it ended up being quite a different experience. Perhaps due to Falcom's relatively hands-off approach when it came to the home console releases at the time, this meant there were major layout differences to the game's worlds, towns and dungeons, alongside further changes to the game's soundtrack. Its debut on the Famicom was also modest, as it sold 7,146 copies in its first 3 days on sale, before subsequently selling another 6,000 in the next 2 weeks, bringing total sales up to almost 13,000. By the end of the year, this number had risen to almost 40,000, positioning Ys as one of the top 50 best-selling games released on the Famicom that year, and selling more than the likes of Hanjaku Hero from Square, 1943 from Capcom, and the console port of the original Double Dragon. The Sega Mark III version fared slightly better in terms of quality though, as the port was reprogrammed and published by Sega themselves. It was brought to market in October of that same year, and because Sega opted to try and stick to matching the original PC-88 offering, the differences were minor by comparison with the Famicom version, such as dungeon maps occasionally being flipped horizontally from their original rotation. However, despite the port being more faithful, its market performance was quite poor, even when taking into consideration the poor market share of the Mark III. And this meant by the end of the year, only 1,300 copies of Ys had been sold on the Mark III. Despite this performance, Sega saw the potential for Ys outside of Japan, so they opted to port it to the Master System. This was then a notable step, as it was not only the first version of Ys to be released outside of Japan, but it was also the first time a Nihon Falcom game had been released internationally. The Master System port of Ys was released abroad in that same year, and Sega's hunch proved to be correct. Magazines such as Ace, CVG, and The Games Machine all gave glowing reviews, the latter of which likened it to The Legend of Zelda, and at the time, it was considered one of the top-rated Sega Master System role-playing games available, alongside Phantasy Star, which released around the same time. But that was not the end of Ys's journey, as in 1989, ports were produced for the IBM PC and the Apple IIgs, the latter of which was rather poetic, considering how Nihon Falcom got their start as an official distributor of Apple products. After the successful launch of Ys, Falcom started to explore ways they could further enrich enjoyment of the game beyond the game itself, and this saw them turn to music. Around the same time that Ys had been released, Falcom had worked with Apollon Music Industry Corps to release an extensive musical work related to Dragon Slayer 2. It was called All Over Xanadu, and it contained music from Xanadu and Xanadu Scenario 2. Except instead of being a straight original soundtrack that contained all the original music featured across both games, All Over Xanadu centered around 11 arrangements which were arranged by Ikiro Fujiwara, also known as Amadeus, who had previously worked on numerous anime productions. These arrangements were then performed by the so-called Xanadu Rocklight Orchestra, a purposeful group of eclectic musicians, many of whom were performing video game music for the first time in their careers. As Ys's soundtrack was one of the most heavily praised parts of the game, they opted to further dip their toes into the world of recorded video game music, and released a soundtrack for the game on vinyl, CD and cassette on the 5th of November 1987. It was released by Falcom through a record label called Starchild, a subsidiary of King Records which specialised in anime music and film. And the soundtrack itself featured the game's entire score by Koshiro, Ishikawa and Hashimoto, in addition to a few new arrangements headed up by Ryo Yonemitsu, a composer and musician brought in on the recommendation of King Records. And he was instrumental in establishing what became the series' signature sound of roaring heavy metal guitar over intricate arrangements. Due to King Records' experience in the anime industry, the collaboration with Falcom was a natural fit, and it wasn't long until Falcom decided to take things a step further and established their own label, called Falcom Label, in 1988. King Records still served as the distributor for Falcom Label's releases, building off of their relationship. But this step established Nihon Falcom as one of the first companies to formalize the release of their game's soundtracks as recorded music, becoming pioneers in the industry as a result. Outside of the music, Ys's release was also successful enough to warrant it receiving its own anime adaptation in the form of a short OVA series. The first batch, which was released between the end of 1989 and the fall of 1991, saw 7 30-minute episodes created. Production of the first 4 was handled by Studio Urban Product, with Studio Tokyo Kids handling the final 3. And they remained largely faithful to the original game, albeit with some changes to make it better suit the new medium. Fans had to then wait another year to see the series continue. It returned in 1992 with a further 4 episodes based on the sequel to Ys, with production again handled by Studio Tokyo Kids. The connection between the two games then highlighted a purposeful relationship, as when discussing the legacy of Ys, it's impossible not to discuss its successor, Ys 2, due largely to the fact that their stories are so interlinked. Released less than a year after the original game, Ys 2 picked up right where Ys left off, and continued Adol's adventure, this time in the land of Ys itself. The in-depth story behind Ys 2's development is a subject for another day though, so be sure to subscribe to Datalog to ensure you don't miss out when we talk about it. But following its release, Falcom often treated the two games as a single package, though still as distinct experiences. The first iteration of this concept was seen in December of 1989, when enhanced versions of Ys 1 and 2 were released on the PC Engine home console. This new system was developed by Hudson Soft and manufactured by NEC, the company responsible for the PC-88, and it was a solid attempt to bring PC quality gaming experiences to the living room, something that Kato and Falcom were very interested in exploring, especially considering that, in Japan, the system was quickly proving itself to be a strong competitor to both Nintendo and Sega's console offerings. In its first 6 months on sale in Japan, the PC Engine had almost outsold the Sega Mark III's lifetime sales, and by late 1989 was outselling the brand new Sega Mega Drive by a ratio of more than 2-1. Thus, Falcom worked hard on this new version of Ys 1 and 2, completely remaking the game less than 2 years after the first entry had even been released, which saw them rework the game's graphical presentation, general sound design, and even going so far as to include new anime-style cutscenes. Taking advantage of the PC Engine's CD-ROM expansion, they were even able to include a completely updated and reorchestrated soundtrack of high-quality audio, alongside something truly astonishing for the time: actual voice acting. Also released for the North American equivalent of the PC-88, the TurboGrafx-16, Ys 1 and 2 was critically acclaimed in both Japan and the West, receiving top marks from publications like GamePro, Famitsu and EGM, who all highlighted the game's presentation and soundtrack as standout features. Continuing this trend, Ys 1 and 2 were later remade, this time for Windows, first as Ys 1 and 2 Complete in Japan in 2001, and then as Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles in 2009, before being released worldwide as Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles Plus in 2013. Ys 1 and 2 also found its way to a number of other systems, such as the Japanese-only PlayStation 2 version called Ys 1 and 2 Eternal Story, and Ys 1 and 2 DS, a completely different reimagining of the games for the Nintendo DS. Even released on mobile platforms in April of 2015, something which allowed fans of Adol's Adventure to play the Chronicles version of the original game wherever they pleased. It's the original version that made the biggest impact though, and it was all down to their decision to change their entire development philosophy to craft games that were fun and engaging to make, not just to play. And at the centre of this was the notion of kindness. It was through this lens that they implemented accessible gameplay that made it easy for newcomers to pick up and play, and when coupled with its Save Anywhere system, this ensured that meaningful progress could always be made, while not removing the challenge. On top of that, its audio-visual identity has endured as one of the most influential aspects, from detailed and immersive design elements like its character portraits, to its fantastic soundtrack, which helped spearhead an entire new industry with regards to the commercial releasing of full game soundtracks. So while Ys may be lesser known in the West, its importance to not only role-playing games but video games as a whole cannot be understated, and it's for that reason that this series has continued to flourish for so long. But with that, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Darryl, and together with Colin, we hope you've enjoyed listening to the incredible development history of the original Ys. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing and editing a video like this by giving it a like. Because as we're a new channel, any interactions you make will really help us out. We're also very thankful for all the support we've received so far on Patreon, including that of Nate Dogg, who is a legendary scholar. Patreon supporters get access to history videos like this one a week early, so if you sign up now, you'll soon be able to get access to the next episode in the series, which is focused on Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, as well as a full-length bonus episode that's Patreon exclusive, that's all about Hydelide. You can find out more at patreon.com/datalog. Alright everyone, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.